Hello and welcome back to the panel discussion where we're going to talk about the research findings that I was presenting on just a little while ago. So I'm joined here today by three different scholars who have quite different expertise on the kinds of things that I was talking about today. We're really lucky to have, first of all, Naomi Kruger in the room. Hi, Naomi.
Hi.
Naomi lectures in creative writing at the University of Central Lancashire, and her debut novel, May, was published in 2018 by Seren, and we're going to be lucky enough to hear a few minutes of reading from Naomi from that novel today. She's published in various literary journals as well, and she has an MA and PhD from Lancaster University. And she was recently awarded the Eccles Centre Fellowship to research her second novel at the British Library. We've also got Chloe. Hi, Chloe.
Hello.
Dr. Chloe Harrison is Senior Lecturer in English Language and Literature at Aston University, UK. Very much like me, her research interests include cognitive stylistics, specifically the application of cognitive grammar for literary linguistic analysis, rereading and contemporary fiction. She has a good few publications in this area, including, for example, cognitive grammar in contemporary fiction. And what's interesting about Chloe's research is she's always looking at how readers respond to the kinds of features that I was talking about earlier. So we're going to hear from Chloe first. She's going to give a few slides on her response to my research findings. The third person we have in the room today is Professor Tess McGuinness from Queen's as well. She's a Professor of Lifelong Learning at Queen's University Belfast. Hi, Tess. You want to say hi?
Yeah.
And much of her work is in adult education. She teaches literature and obtained her BA from Trinity College, Dublin, and her MA from Queen's, and her PhD from York University, Toronto. Tess has published many books and articles, as well as a book of poems, a poet in her own right. And importantly for today, she edited Dementia and Literature, Interdisciplinary Perspectives, which was published by Routledge in 2017. So what we're going to do is hear from Chloe, first of all, some of her responses to my research findings. Then we'll hear from Naomi reading from her beautiful novel, May, and then we'll together have a group discussion and then open it up to the audience and let you join in and talk about some of the issues that have been raised, okay? So first of all, I will hand over to Naomi and to Chloe, and she can present us her slides. So hopefully we'll see those come on screen now.
So thank you, Jane, for that kind introduction. Hopefully you can see the slides now. And thanks also to the rest of the organising team for inviting me to this morning's panel. I think there's some really fascinating data sets that you were telling us about this morning, particularly in regards to the linguistic patterns in the contemporary dementia fiction corpus. And I really look forward to hearing more about the reader response data as well. So I thought what I'd do in this brief response, and I will keep it brief because I'm quite keen to chat with everyone about their ideas on this, is just to reflect on your two central research questions. And I thought I'd frame it in the light of my own recent reading in the case of the first question, and some recent research that I've carried out in the case of the second question. So through this, I'm essentially moving back from your large-scale study and returning to some smaller examples, just to continue these observations further in a slightly more kind of micro context. And then I have some questions of my own at the end, which perhaps we can cycle back round to later, or I can ask you another time. So recently, just to put this in context, recently I did carry out a small-scale study looking at the novel Elizabeth is Missing, where, like Jane and the team, I was interested in how the character Maud, how her perspective was shown in the language, and how this sets up a distinctive reading experience in the course of the novel. It's interesting to see actually how the observations that I noted in my small-scale qualitative study regarding, for example, the flashback presentation, the schematic descriptions, and also under lexicalization bears out in the larger corpus data as well. So that's really fascinating as a starting point. So how are the minds of characters with dementia represented in fictional language? The first thing I wanted to raise was, I guess I wondered if we could perhaps spend a little bit more time thinking about personhoods and some of the ideas that you flagged up this morning, Jane. So again, some broader context to this. My sister is a carer for people with dementia, and I spoke with her about this festival in advance of me coming today. And she mentioned, without me talking about the particular findings from the project, that self-dialogue was something she had noticed with the people that she works closely with. She said sometimes it's almost as though they're giving themselves a set of instructions in order to do things. So you and the team, Jane, then identify the strategies used in the novels to kind of show this personhood, and also particularly, I guess, that idea of sort of split personhood or kind of multiple iterations of the self. So you touched upon the idea of body part as an actor, a character being excluded from interactions and so on. And I wonder whether we could talk a little bit more about this divided self, division of self setup, and where we might see this in the fiction examples a bit further. So to that end, I've been recently reading Ali Smith's brilliant novel, There But For There, and notice this really nice example from the character May. I won't read it out, but you can see in the extracts on the screen that even from the layouts and the way it's structured, that she's having a chat with herself. She's asking herself questions and answering them, and there's a clear back and forth dialogue with herself. A container metaphor also runs throughout the example, where she specifically talks about confinement. So she talks about the head and the heart being confined spaces, and then elaborates this metaphor later on with the coffin joke, and kind of extends that metaphor further. So I wanted to pose a few follow-on questions about the representation of personhoods, and these are directed to Jane and the team in particular. So I'm interested in how does the body is container metaphor appear across the data set? Is this example, for example, typical of the ones that you saw? Where this idea of a divided self appears in the data, and also what other language choices and patterns does it appear with? So does it co-occur with any other instances of language use or patterns? And more generally, I wonder whether this linguistic feature was something mentioned or flagged in the reading groups as being particularly prominent, and that's something hopefully we can come back to. So moving on then to my final and third slide. So how do readers respond to fictional characters with dementia? So I really liked the metaphors that you used to talk about this process. So walking in someone's shoes, or even kind of trying on a viewpoint or perspective. So even the phrase trying on is metaphorical, isn't it? You know, you try on hats or you try on clothes. So this is something that we see quite frequently here. And we can definitely say that experiencing vicarious points of view is something that's central to the reading experience. I was intrigued about how this was linguistically framed by the readers in the reading group data. So I had some reader data from the reader website Goodreads that was a sort of leftover from my Elizabeth is Missing project that I went back to just to see whether these readers in this online review context were also talking about increased levels of understanding and awareness, and to see whether some of the other observations in your study also applied to readers in broader context. And this is a very small scale a test, but I wanted to just to have a look. Again, I'm not going to go through these in detail, but I think it's clear here that Maud's point of view seemed to be a central part of the reading experience for the readers of this novel. So in these few examples, there does seem to be an awareness of the language choices, or at least the author's role in the construction of perspective. Reader 2 here, for example, talks about the author constructing a portrait. Reader 3 discusses the craft of storytelling. Reader 5 observes how they are amazed that Emma Healy got into the mind of a woman with full-blown dementia. And incidentally, that reader is also drawing on another body as a container metaphor in that description. I also like the description here of the movement and the differences in directionality between the readers, particularly readers 3 and reader 4. Reader 3 says that Healy brings the drama into our rooms. So just kind of brings into your own homes, into your rooms. You're looking at it in front of you. So here we kind of see a description, a movement towards the reader. And reader 4 says that how, conversely, that you're moved into the position. So there's a movement away towards the character from the reader. With reader 5, on the other hand, it's the author rather than the reader doing the metaphorical movement into the mind of the character. So that kind of directionality and movement I found really fascinating. The Into Our Rooms description seemed particularly significant in light of some of the marketing choices for these books as well. And I noticed this as I was putting these slides together. So the open door offering a snapshot into an interior room in this particular Elizabeth is Missing cover, the foregrounded armchair and similarly domestic setting on the cover of There But For There on the previous slide. They're there to kind of invite the reader in, aren't they? So some final questions to finish with then. So I wondered about the cross-referencing of these two data sets and what you plan to do with those data sets. So in the responses, do readers talk about those language choices you identify in the corpus data as being particularly prominent? Do they frame their responses using such metaphors as walking in the shoes of the character? You noted that readers in the Living with Dementia group in the second data set observed that the accounts were realistic or authentic, and I think Stephen Fay asked a question about this earlier as well. Did they explore what in particular felt real to them, or what was authentic about it? And finally, and as a follow-on and one for the more general discussions, I wondered whether readers identifying a point of view as being particularly realistic or authentic has a direct bearing on how they feel positioned as readers. So do they feel themselves closer if they deemed it more realistic, for example? And I think I'll leave it there with my response and hand back over to you, Jane.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Chloe. That was great, and so many questions for me there. They're still all floating around in my head, so if you have a note of them, we can come back to some of them.
Yeah,
I think
sure.
maybe the metaphor question was one that stuck out. So do those kinds of metaphors repeat themselves? And it's the body is a container. Was that right? The body is so the body of the person with dementia is a container for emotions or for the illness. So those kind. Just one example that kind of jumped out at me and that I know the readers responded to quite strongly was more that the body is enacted upon by the dementia, almost a ship at sea, I think was the example from the novel Out of Mind, and being in stormy waves and then symptoms calming again and being affected by some kind of supernatural force. And that was one metaphor that I think the readers responded quite strongly to, but obviously there were many, so I'll have to think about that in more detail. But what we'll do now is, thanks so much for all of those questions that you raised, Chloe, and I think we'll come back to them in our discussion afterwards. We'll go over to Naomi and hear from Naomi on May, her novel.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, another May. I hadn't read Ali Smith's book, so when I wrote this. So yeah, I'm just going to read a little bit from my novel, quite a short section, but I just wanted to give some context first. So the novel is partly narrated by May, the main character, who is in a care home. She's living with dementia. And her parts of the novel are quite short and fragmented, and they take place over the course of one day. But during that day, she's continually searching back in her memories for the truth about Ned, who is a little red-haired boy she remembers, but she can't quite pinpoint who he was or what happened to him. And this search is made difficult, obviously, because her memory is impaired, but also because she's distracted by the physical space that she's in, the disruption of the care home, and her difficulty with communication and perception, trying to place herself, what is her role in this place that she finds herself in. But around her sections of the novel are the stories and voices of other characters connected to her. So we have her husband, her daughter, her grandson, and a care worker in the home the only care worker she trusts in the home. So one of the things I was trying to do was this really difficult thing, and it's already been talked about, this trying to imagine what it might be like to be in that experience and to try and somehow communicate and represent that on the page through language, which is very hard. But I also wanted to show that May is part of a wider community, that she's a mother and a grandmother, that she's part of a family, that she has a history, and that she still matters and she still has ways to connect with people. And so in the other parts of the novel narrated by other characters, they take place at shifting moments in time, and we get glimpses into their perception of how she's changing, but also who she was to them and how she's mattered in their lives in the past. So what I'm going to read to you is one of May's sections, which is very short, and you might see some of the things coming up that have already been talked about today, followed directly by a short section from Alex and her grandson's, one of his chapters, and just a little bit of context for that bit that I think you might need. So Alex in this moment is 18. He's just passed his driving test. He's taken his best friend Lorna out for a picnic, and he's in love with her, but she doesn't return the feeling. And they're planning a gap year, but it's sort of going to go wrong. And I guess the other thing to note is that he's very close to May. She's his grandma, and he's not dealing very well with the way their relationship is changing. So I think that's all the context you need to know. And I'm going to just do a brief reading now. 9:42 a.m. They only think about themselves. I could tell them a thing or two. I could. If they stop putting these whatsits all over the place, don't need the things on my knees. I don't need them everywhere. I like a straight back. I like to be able to see in the corners, in the dark places, behind trees and feathers and birds' eggs. He brought messages. I see the stars. I hear the rolling thunder. I want to hear the music, but there are people talking on the watching thingy, talking and clapping and shouting their uncouth ways. Why would anyone want to see this when there is so much more? The boy, the sun in his hair as he runs to the trees. There are more things in heaven and earth. I'm just going to read to Alex's part now. 18th of June, 2003. Lorna pushes herself up over the gate first. I try not to look at her legs, muscled from years of long-distance running and netball and an inexhaustible energy. She sits down under a tree, back straight like a yoga instructor, and I sit next to her with my back against the trunk, right in the shade. Look up. The rough-grooved bark against my scalp, the light filtering through the little oval leaves fanned out, barely moving. It's an ash. I can still remember the shapes from the pocket guide to trees Nan bought me the year before high school. We used to go out, her and me, and I would actually carry the bloody thing around so I could tick off every one I identified. The plastic bag rustles as Lorna roots around for the sandwich without tomatoes in it. We eat. We surround ourselves with debris. We pretend not to be pissed off with each other. The grass is parched, scattered with buttercups, the sour animal smell of cowpat or sheep crap or manure from somewhere nearby. She dabs sun cream on her nose, twists her hair up. For a minute, I think she might ask me to do the back of her neck. I'm going to finish the plan and then we can talk about it, okay? Fine. I lean back and close my eyes and try not to think about her neck or anything else. I replace her with darkness, spring rain and mud, jumping off the stile not so far from here in my green wellies with Nan. Sticking to the official routes, the rough wooden markers, the trampled-in paths in the corner of fields, over hills and cloughs and unexpected bridges. There were always sheep. I used to find them funny, bleating insults to each other like miserable old men, bellies hanging down, ready to flood the place with spring cliches. She stopped me by the river once, Nan, when I was busy looking down at the boggy ground, trying not to get sucked under. Shh, she said. The old man's sleeping. I squinted over the stone wall, my heart going fast, expecting to see a dirty tramp or a man with a beard made of moss half buried. There was no one there. Not that way, up and across, she said, pointing out to the fells, out over the fields behind the next farm. It was the nearest hill she meant. She crouched down and traced the shape of it for me. Can't you see him there, lying on his back? He's sleeping off his dinner. I couldn't at first. It was just another bit of landscape. But then there was his beer belly, the dip of a neck, the outline of a chin, the blurred profile of his sleeping face. I held my breath, and there was nothing but the sound of lapwings calling. I swear I saw his stomach move. I thought of Grandad, probably sleeping himself, laid out on the sofa, his belly all disappeared, his cheek starting to sink. Nan was shading her eyes from a sudden burst of sunlight, still looking out across to the old man. His hair grows back curly every spring, she said, and I saw the promise of it in the new green leaves, the massive trees around his head, running along his spine. Maybe by autumn, it'll be the same colour as yours. I'm going to stop there.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Naomi. That was beautiful. And I can definitely see some of the similar techniques that I find in my data anyway. Especially, so you've got the use of the first person and then switching point of views for different characters. So maybe that helps to flesh out the story. And then also you've got the present tense. And I forgot to say this earlier, but so much of my data was in the present tense. Well, I don't know if that lends something particular to the narrative. What do you think?
Yeah, there was something about the immediacy of present tense. It's a way to kind of plunge the reader into a moment, or to give the impression of that. And it's quite hard to maintain, I have to say, over the course of a novel and in first person. But it did feel, to me anyway, the best way to kind of try and communicate that feeling of being in a moment and having it happen. And especially in May's voice, that felt quite important.
Yeah, so I don't think you're the only one. I definitely noticed that was quite common, more than usual, in the dementia narratives that I studied. We'll go over to Tess now. Hi, Tess. Thanks for listening to that. Based on your expertise and having brought together all those ideas on dementia and literature, not just fiction, in one edited volume, what are your thoughts today?
Well, I mean, thank you very much, first of all, to Accidental Theatre and the organising committee for inviting me, and indeed, Jane, lovely to be with you and the other contributors today. Maybe just springing off the last little dialogue that you had there about present tense, and I think that if I may, there's a lot of, we're talking earlier about older people and people living with dementia, living in the moment. But of course, that's quite complex when you think about it, because what we also have is almost William James's notion of durée, of all that's going on in our minds as we're in the moment. And we see that in Mrs. Dalloway, for example. With that sort of stream of consciousness. And of course, when people are living with dementia, perhaps the memories of the past are more pronounced. But as you account for in your own findings, there's a lot of, and it comes out in the lovely piece of reading that Chloe did, or that Naomi did. And so we have this idea of intertextuality as well, so that the references that are swirling within the narrator's or the character's mind are going back not just to people and personal experiences, but to pieces of literature, to songs. I recognized a bit of a hymn there in the middle of it all. And I think, again, that's very authentic to the experience of dementia, and the sharpness of sensory apprehensions, but also almost an increasing sharpness sometimes about memories of the immediate, of the very far back past. Mm-hmm. And then, how that sometimes coalesces in an almost paradoxical way or circular way, in that the person living with dementia thinks that their long dead parent is still there, and they're having a conversation. And that notion of self-dialogue, I think, is very, very interesting as well. And I remember many examples of this in people that I have known and have been privileged to know who live with dementia. And I had an aunt who was really a very intelligent woman, and she looked in the mirror one day and she said, "Who's that old cat?" And at the same time, she was perfectly capable, even though she had quite advanced dementia, of correcting her granddaughter's grammar. And she'd been a teacher. She went, "Grammar?" So I know with my own mother as well, that and some of it is kind of self-mockery too, that self-dialogue. But I find myself doing this now, where I'm in one room and I say to myself, I ask myself, what did I come in here for? And then I find the thing and I say, but what did I want to do with that?
We all do that.
So maybe it's no harm to have an odd senior moment earlier on in life. So that the self-dialogue, of course, is kind of a form of drama. It's a form, literally, of enactment. Yes. And maybe enactment is power. And we had been speaking off camera there a wee while ago about how that is particularly important in drama, and that drama as a form, is a brilliant way of giving people power who have no power. And that's one of the things that happens with dementia. So you see that in Lear, who gives away his power and then, rues it bitterly. And in Beckett, in Waiting for Godot, which is a kind of contemporary grandchild of Lear, as it were. It's ancestrally related to Lear. And you see there that the characters indulge in a kind of music hall stickomythia, rapid, quick fire humor. And of course, that's a way of, the psychologists would talk about stimulation. And one of the things why that's so powerful in every sense, I suppose, is because very often what can happen, people with dementia, they're very lonely, they're very isolated, they're siloed, and what happens is they become quieter and quieter, and indeed sometimes mute completely. So I think in terms of deficit models, I want to suggest throw forward some discussion about agency, about personhood. We never think about personhood when we're talking about children, and we small children. And yet, do they really have Cartesian rationality? I don't think so. There's a lot of adults who don't have much rationality either, but that's another question. I suppose another thing that I'd like to talk about, which has been touched on very eloquently already, is this whole kind of notion of the almost sort of supreme fiction, as Wallace Stevens calls it, of people writing about dementia who don't have dementia. And you have all sorts of quite nice terms for this within your own research, very nice technical terms for it, hetero and homo and so on. But the whole point here is, who can, the problem is that a person with advanced dementia maybe can't write, or can they write in some other form? What are we doing? And I mean, this is a question for you as a novelist. What do we do, and why do we do novels about dementia or poems about dementia? I wrote a number of poems years ago, because my mother was becoming even trickier, and that's the term that we used. And we didn't know she had dementia, but I had been trying to understand why she was so angry, and so I tried to inhabit her imaginative space. So I think, we can have kind of poetic inquiry.
It's an interesting.
There can be.
It's an interesting point you make there, Tess. We've been talking about how reading this kind of fiction can help readers understand, but I think that's an amazing point, that how writing this kind of stuff it's often the writers want to understand more too, and that's a process. The writing process is a process of coming to an understanding.
I suppose all great writing, and you touched on this, is about inhabiting the other. And the problem is that we have othered people with dementia so much that there is a real need, and you can see the fluorescence of writing about this as a kind of very interesting creative response. I mean, you teach creative writing, so maybe you could talk about that far better than me. But those are just some of the things maybe that we could, sort of talk about.
Would you like to respond to that, Naomi?
Yeah, I think it's really a really interesting point. And I think as a writer, writers are always trying to imagine their way, like you say, into an experience they don't personally have. There's nothing new about that at all. It's an act of imagination. But when there's a power differential, and I think what you're saying about agency, when you're writing about a person who's part of a marginalised community, who maybe doesn't have or isn't given as much of a voice as they should have, and when there are negative stereotypes around them that are harmful and can actually have an impact on the way that they're treated and the way they experience the world, I do think that writers do have a responsibility to think carefully about the way they do that. And that's what I tried to do. I'm not saying I've found the one way to do it. Of course not. There's still lots of ways and creative ways to respond. But I had to think very carefully about how much research I did, also how I was going to represent May's voice or consciousness on the page. And there is a sense in which it's never going to be accurate. What would an accurate portrayal of dementia look like? Because even if you could do that, you're talking about an individual person who's not just the symptoms of dementia, they are also a human being with history, and they react differently to their environment. So there's a sense of having the courage to take risks and do it. But I do think as a writer, there were moments where I thought the most ethical thing for me to do is just not do it. But I'm a writer, and so I kept going. And also I think it is important to have lots of different stories out in the world that engage with this, so that readers and people who can imagine different ways to think about it and make those connections.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I think earlier on, Tess touched on something about how when it's put into words like this, whether in a narrative or in a dramatic form in drama, it's an enactment. So as you said, that whether that enactment is accurate or not is difficult to ascertain, difficult to measure, and up for discussion. But there's just that very enactment it's doing something important, isn't it?
I think so. Sorry, Jane. I was just thinking. I think you had a slide. I didn't get to see all of your presentation, but around first person versus third person. And again, I'm not saying that first person is better than third. They just do different things. But one of the reasons I chose to use first person was because of that sense of wanting to reduce the distance between reader and character somehow. That sense of, I think it is too easy, and I've done it myself, to think I'm here and the person with dementia is over here, and I've got all my faculties and I've got access to my memories, and people with dementia haven't. But I wanted to reduce that distance, because as we've all been saying, actually there are so many commonalities of understanding. All our memories are faulty, and so if you can kind of reduce that distance in some way, I think that can be interesting to try and do.
Yeah, and it did seem like the readers responded slightly more to the first-person narratives. There was one thing I noticed in my study anyway about the third-person narratives. So because you can use free and direct discourse in the third person to get inside the character's mind, albeit from a he, she did this kind of perspective, that seemed to be often used by the authors to produce what's called, in narrative studies, psychonarration. So almost very fluid words and language that a character with very advanced dementia, I'm thinking particularly of the Madonnas of Leningrad, it's used there a lot. So the character Marina has quite advanced dementia, but her language is very florid and not typical of someone with dementia, but you still feel like you're inside her mind. So that psychonarration is basically when the character is attributed with language that they wouldn't be capable of in that moment, which is an interesting ethical kind of position as well, isn't it? I don't know what you think about that, Tess, because you were kind of commenting on an enactment, and that's an enactment of a completely different stance, if you know what I mean.
Oh yeah, I mean it's interesting because I mean again, when you think about Lear and you think about Waiting for Godot, you know, they never shut their mouth, you know, and certainly not short of they're not short of a metaphor, and indeed florid, and you use a word like florid, which is used, of course, to describe in a negative way as somebody who is undergoing a manic episode where there is great fluidity or indeed you know, fluidity of ideation as well, or flight of ideas as it's sometimes called. My own experience is that people with dementia don't always suffer from linguistic deficiency, and that certainly haven't been the case in my own family. I wonder, you know, where I get it from then. But the other thing that happens is also kind of on the literary spectrum in a way, and that's called fabulation. Now, you know, most of us think of fabulation as quite a good thing. And indeed, Naomi, you know, you'd be out of business if it wasn't a good thing. And most of us would be out of business because we talk about fables and fabulation and making up stuff all the time, but actually sometimes people living with dementia make up stuff, and you'll find carers and loved ones complaining bitterly that the person has made up stories about them and accused them of sleeping with people, or all sorts of quite outrageous things. But you see, I think in another way that's brilliant, because what it shows is the fiction making faculty. The imaginative faculty, as Coleridge would have called it. So even though you're going, my God, she didn't say that about me, at the same time, the stories show it's another kind of enactment. In the way that a child has that kind of uninhibited imagination. So it may be to do with what happens with memory. I'm not a psychologist, so I can't account for that. But I think that my instinct is that image-making faculty, that Coleridge calls it, and the fiction, the telling of stories, is a thing that's strongest in childhood. And people go back to their childhood. So there's something going on there, neurologically or emotionally, and again, some of the fabulation can be quite contestive. And that's another way of enacting, like, will I raise a row here? Will I make a complete scene? And that's quite interesting in its way as well.
Yeah,
and
you're right, Tess. It's almost like reclaiming some sense of agency through telling a story, even if it's not true. Yeah.
Or the person maybe thinks it is true. But I mean, I know somebody, obviously I'm not going to name them, who did this with such skill that I was kind of, even though the story was wild in its wrongness, I actually couldn't help but admire the skill with which the story was made, and indeed remade when the narrative was questioned. So this is what I mean about kind of thinking about moving away from this deficit model.
Yeah, I completely agree, Tess. And I think what you're doing is you're picking up on something I said earlier and developing it in a way that's more positive. And it was in the slides earlier when I talked about how dementia provides a paradox for narrativization, in the sense that, memory requires events in order to make a narrative, and it requires a speaking subject to make a narrator. So I think what we're talking about here is the fact that dementia provides ways of telling different stories, where they don't have to be true, where the accuracy is a different kind of accuracy, maybe, and seeing storytelling as something that's much more varied and maybe not as prescriptive as I put it earlier, which was just a very basic definition. But dementia makes you move away from that for sure.
It's part of the disinhibition, isn't it? And I quite like that. Somebody I know, she was in a garden centre, this person, and she said something to them. I was like, I'll stick a needle in you, and this person had been a nurse, and she threatened him with a rusty needle. And I'm going, my God. But, there's something extraordinarily powerful about that. At the same time, very, very wicked. But, it's some of these kind of, part of it's ludic and part of it is transgressive. And, we'd been speaking about a story like Alice Munro's The Bear Came Over the Mountain. And we don't know, and that's a brilliant example, because we don't know if she's making up her dementia or to get away from her old husband or not. and when she gets there, what do you think? She has an affair with one of the residents, or does she? So Munro is playing with the idea of fiction making, but she's also playing with the idea of sexuality and the body in quite a different way, because we tend to think of the body in most dementia situations as being repulsive and crepitaceous, or that it's crumbling away, falling apart. And here's something that kind of challenges that in a sort of disturbing way, maybe, for some people.
I'll pick up on what you said there, Tess, about the body. And something I mentioned about the findings earlier was that body parts were often used as actors. And I think Chloe had a question on that based around metaphors. Is that right, Chloe?
Yes, I believe so. That was one of the ones I listed, absolutely.
Yeah. So can you rephrase that question for us?
Yes, I think that was related to the kind of container metaphors, right? I think. I guess I was just wondering about that particular passage from the Ali Smith novel, and about whether that was quite sort of typical, whether that we see kind of bodies being conceptualized as containers in that way, or are there other, you mentioned kind of agency of body parts as well in other kinds of contexts, but I was wondering whether that gets reframed, I guess, across the data set.
Yeah, it's definitely a recurring metaphor. And I had a brief chat with my colleague Gemma, who's a cultural gerontologist, and she says it's popular in representing older population in general. And I know even, for example, trying to get images to advertise today's festival, the world is washed with images of old hands, right? And why is it that old hands stands for old people? It's kind of a strange metonymy. We call that in stylistics or in rhetoric, right? So where one body part stands for the whole person. And I find that a lot in the fiction. So there you go. It's not necessarily... sometimes the fiction might be reproducing discourses that are popular and ideologies that are popular in the way just we conceive of old age or in dementia. That's something we haven't really talked about, that, it's not always challenging the stereotypes. The example that you mentioned, body as a container, and then I think I said about how the body was often acted upon by supernatural sources, like a ship on the sea. And then even when I give the talk earlier, you saw an example from Jake, and it said his nails were bitten. Now, in that sentence, it's passive. So it's another way of kind of doing the same thing. It's passive. It doesn't say that he remembers having bitten his nails or he had bitten his nails. It's almost like it happened without him knowing. So there are other ways, not just in the metaphors, but also in the structure of sentences, that agency can be removed as well. Now, I'm not saying that's always because the author is taking away agency from the character. It's just maybe that's the way it's represented. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that agency.
Just to come in again there, I think that's interesting that you mentioned about kind of agency, and also kind of, I guess, going back to what Tess was saying, kind of giving power sort of through stories as well, and challenging these sort of stereotypes. I think that's something we're starting to see in the examples. I mean, I haven't read all of the novels you're talking about in your data set, but to go back to Elizabeth is Missing, that's one of the reasons why actually I really love that novel, because it's a kind of mystery novel, and Maud as a protagonist is someone who takes it upon herself to solve this mystery, is an unlikely candidate for a detective, and actually, she kind of solves it really in the end, and it's through her that kind of iterations and of kind of memories and going back to flashbacks that she does it. So I think that's a really nice way of kind of challenging stereotypes and kind of giving back power to Maud.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a lot of humour in that novel as well, if I remember. But Elizabeth's things like Tess was saying, the humour really comes through. For example, I think remember one scene where Maud is living with her daughter and her granddaughter, and the granddaughter, she's forgotten who she is. She walks into the kitchen, leaves her dirty dishes by the sink, and Maud says, "Oh, I would fire that help first chance I get. Get rid of her. She's no good." Right. So you got a lot of humour in there too.
Absolutely.
There's one thing about this business about body parts, and I keep thinking about. The existentialist here, and that phrase "le regard," or as sometimes in colonial fiction, the gaze, the gaze, and actually, what I didn't know, but my mother used to stare at me, and I used to think she's cross for me, and what the hell have I done now? And it was very disconcerting. But actually, I realised afterwards that this was a feature of some people's dementia, that they got this kind of fixed stare. so that they didn't mean to stare, but they were immobilized, so to speak. Do you know what I mean? So that there's a sense in which they didn't have control over certain parts of their body. So there's that whole notion of the involuntary, and we tend to, you know, that's what I'm saying, that I made the terrible mistake of thinking that my mother was accusingly staring at me, where in fact she couldn't help it.
Yeah.
You know, and the other thing, you know, with speech, again, that involuntary, what we used to call hamster on the wheel, where of repetition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and as her dementia advanced, the repetition became more intense, or congested. But then again, one of the weird things is that fiction also does repetition, does pattern. Do you see what I mean? And actually, the stories that older people tell about their past are particular stories. They have their own repertoire, but there's a whole other tracts of their lives that they won't talk about at all. So again, the narrative has they have particular shapes, and we are all artful to some extent in that sense. Although some are more artful than others. Indeed, Naomi, as you will know, but there's that sense in which we all want to make meaning by having a story that is the story of our life. Even people saying it's the story of my life. So, you know, it's about patterning. Mm-hmm. And I think if we look at this in much more positively, we start to see the similarities and parallelisms with how fiction itself is created. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, Naomi, as a writer, you know, you might say, well, the story just took over, you know. Mm-hmm. It was nothing to do with me, Gov, you know. And maybe that's what, I don't know, just something to think about.
I know, I think that's a lovely point, Tess, that there is something, the creativity and the poetic nature of language is not just something that is produced in creative writing. It is found in all kinds of language, and certainly in people with dementia expressing themselves as well. And I think that kind of came out in one of the examples that Naomi mentioned was the watching thing. That was the under lexicalization is the technical word that we call for that. But I think it was a TV. Is that right, Naomi?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The watching thing. And the whirly spinner I mentioned earlier for a fan. So just the very basic reframing, or just calling something, a word in a new way, is something that's part of everyday language, but also a part of, I've noticed in the fiction, that just makes you stop and think about it in a different way. You know, it's almost like a metaphor in itself. It is figurative language, and it's beautiful. And that brings me now, we've got a few minutes left before we're going to go to Q&A, so I thought we'd better talk about the reader's side of things, which Chloe was drawing more on, and that kind of, we know and talk about it a lot in our fields, Chloe, about how the language of fiction or of literature, because it does use unusual things like that, like the whirly spinner or metaphors that are creative and unusual, it makes you slow down and think. So did you want to return to any of the questions that you raised
I had
earlier?
a couple. I know this is something which is an ongoing, you've got lots of data that you're going through, so apologies if I'm going to ask something you haven't had a look at yet. I guess I was just interested in that kind of comment you flagged from the group, the Living with Dementia group in particular, and they mentioned about the kind of high level of realism that they experienced or kind of noted in their reading process. Yeah. And I just wondered whether that has whether actually they were talking about particular language choices indirectly. I mean, if you're going to tallying it with your first data set where you flagged up all of those recurring features or at least things that we see or typically see, I wondered if they did kind of peg it to particular things in the text, and whether that might have a bearing on, you know, the level of realism as well, whether that does have a bearing on kind of reader positioning. You know, are they more likely to feel sympathetic if the realism is higher? Is that something that's necessary in this context?
It's a good question, and I think we definitely have to do more study of the data, especially the marked up extracts, because that was my technique for trying to get to that bit between finding out what readers think and being able to link it to a specific part of the text. Because if you say, what did you think of that piece of under-lexicalization? That's just not going to work. Sure, it's not, we have a very technical vocabulary for the language that's there on the page that we can't expect anyone else to pick up on so quickly. So that the marked up extracts is where I'm going to find that. The thing is that only some of the group posted them back. I had to remember to put them in the stamped envelope and send them back. But I'm going to have to look also at the discussions, because sometimes they really did jump onto a metaphor. The one I mentioned earlier about being a ship out at sea was very evocative for some of the group. That feeling of powerlessness and the symptoms being taken over. Things like the very detailed memories, and I'm thinking of one particular male who responded to a male character who talked about Holland and the canal boats and these very evocative memories and images that really resonated with him because he was a lorry driver who spent a lot of time in Holland, things like that. Then you had so the under-lexicalization, which, to remind people, is when a word is used in place of another word. So the whirly spinner for the fan, often they would go, oh, what's that? So, natural reaction, what on earth is a whirlies? And then they would talk it through and come to the same realization, oh, she's talking about the fan. And so they seem to enjoy that process of slowing down and talking over the literature and saying, yeah, we do that all the time. I obviously forget words for things all the time, and that's one way around it. And it added to their appreciation of the literature, and it also seemed to be real for them. So I don't know if that answers any of your question. They did pick out on aspects of the fictional language which were interesting to them, and they discussed it at length. And a lot of it was the same kind of thing I was picking out.
Yeah, just interesting. Yeah, what they see as more marked or what's more foregrounded to them. I guess that's quite fascinating in itself, actually. The kinds of things that they're identifying. And in terms of their own responses, did they kind of frame? You mentioned empathy a little bit towards the end. Did they frame their experiences using those lovely metaphors you mentioned about trying on perspectives or walking in someone's shoes? Were they drawing on those kinds of metaphors when they were responding? Did you notice? No.
We tried not to say the word empathy, and this is Carolina, who was very careful. We didn't want to put words into the mouths of the respondents in general. So we're not talking about the group with dementia here. We're talking about the other reading groups where awareness raising and empathy might have been a response. So we didn't use that word. We had different questions that got to things like, to what extent did your emotions align with the characters? And then can you name them? What were those emotions? So it was things like, did you have the same emotions or did you have different ones? It's kind of to see how much they were emotionally aligned with the characters. And then there were questions around to what extent their viewpoint was aligned. Did you have the same shared perspective? Did you feel any emotions during reading? And where and why, or what were they? Those kinds of questions. So it's quite tricky then we're looking for not direct references to empathy, but to roundabout ways of having some kind of empathetic response.
Absolutely. It's one of the tricky things, isn't it, about empathy studies in general? You have to kind of be indirect, but actually it's tricky to frame questions in that way as well. But yeah, that's fascinating. That
said, a lot of them just came out and said, I felt so sympathetic or empathetic towards the character when this happened. Or the word empathy is used by them, but even then you can't take it to mean one thing.
No, sure. Yeah.
Things for different people. Yeah. Do any of the others want to comment on the reading side of things before we open up to the Q&A from the audience? No? I know you're both writers, Tess and Naomi, so maybe you're used to thinking about it from that perspective. Okay. If there's nothing to add on that side of things, then what we might do is open up to questions from the floor. I know that Richard, my lovely assistant, has to come in and change over the screen for us now so that I can read your questions as they come up. Nope, my screen's gone black there, Richard, I think because the laptop's timed out. So just if everybody could think of what kind of questions you might want to ask, take these time to enter them in the chat. And as soon as I can see them, I will read them out and pose them to the lovely panel we have here. They're just going to turn on the screen now. It just timed out. Okay. We have quite a few that Richard's going to help me scroll through, I think. We've got a question here from Lucy Carolyn. Beckett is perhaps an example of an author writing from the inside of an experience of, if not dementia, a form of cognitive difficulty, especially in the things he wrote towards the end of his life. That is phrased as a question. I know that Tess has already talked about this. If you want to answer that one, Tess.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for the question. He always seemed to be quite interested in mental health and mental ill health, and very early on, actually, and you probably know this, he spent a bit of time in what's called Bedlams, Bethlehem, in a mental hospital, and his first novel is set in a mental hospital. So I think, again, it's a way of what Breck talked about, alienation. It's a deliberate way of kind of othering himself, just as he othered himself out of Dublin and to Paris, and indeed othered himself from English into French. I suppose Joyce having ate most of the linguistic furniture before him. I think that Beckett deliberately chose, as part of his kind of broader philosophical stance as an existentialist, to focus on the lame and the halt, the powerless, those without power, those without speech, those who are not able to move, those whose minds are deranged or unhinged. And of course, what comes out all the time are those two qualities, compassion and humour. And to me, that's again, he takes his cue from Lear there. And we've been talking about this idea of how characters create a sodality or a solidarity between themselves, almost as an opposition to the official system, and because of their powerlessness. So they're waiting for Godot. Godot's never going to come. And so but there's such a sense of them looking after each other. And also that the person with dementia can be a carer, not just the recipient of care. So I think, this comes out so much in Lear as well, and that sodality that they have out there on the heath. And it's so moving. And I think this is another wonderful thing that we can all learn, the importance of friendship, and sometimes family. Family ain't what it used to be. And maybe it never was, as Lear tells us. So, it's about the understanding not just the negativities of other, but the extraordinary gifts and valor of other.
Beautifully put. Thank you, Tess. And I think, if that's one thing that comes out of today, that's what literature can do. It's representing other kinds of seeing things, saying things, whether it's dementia or not. I can't see the screen of questions now. If one of you could read the next one, if there is one there, it's disappeared for me.
I think there's one question for you, Jane, as far as I can see. So it just says, have the metaphors encountered in this research been compiled at all?
Have they been compiled at all?
Mm-hmm.
No. So it was part of the qualitative analysis to explore the 390,000 words of dementia fiction, and I did that using a software in Vivo, and that lets you code things as you go along. So I coded the metaphors, as a metaphor, but it would be a whole other study in itself to go back to that data and find out how exactly those metaphors are phrased. That would be another project in itself. Probably quite an interesting one, which would help to answer Chloe's question that she posed earlier. But right now, I just know there's metaphors there and these kinds of things, but I couldn't give you any, quantities as to these particular kinds of metaphors. So yeah, I think I'm going to be working with this data set for years to come. So I think that's it then for the questions. So we're actually in quite good time to finish up now for a wee bit of lunch and take a little break, everyone, because we'll be coming back at 1:30 for our next panel, The Ethics of Writing Dementia. Thanks so much to my panelists, Tess, Naomi and Chloe, and hopefully we'll get to see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.